If the rapture should occur, some of them will be getting way ahead of us. They're way out there. So nice to see you. And my goodness, I didn't realize this was such a lofty auditorium here. I was sitting up front there. Nice to see you, and my thanks to the pastor for hosting this event here. My colleagues and I have just flown in this evening. Flew in from Atlanta, what seems like ages ago. I was up at about 5 a.m., which would have been 2 a.m. your time, and then went on to Seattle. And from Seattle, waited a couple of hours and found our way here. But it seems like it takes a whole day. Even though I've traveled for so many years, I would have felt what traveling all day, you would have probably gotten farther than it appeared. But that's the way the airlines make it, and we are here. Really always good to be in Canada. Many of you may be well aware that I still hold my Canadian citizenship. I took that up years ago. And so when they ask me at the border, why are you here? I generally feel like saying I was here before you were. And when I arrived in Toronto in 1966, there were only 500 Indians in Toronto. Yeah. Today there are 500,000 of them. If you just walk into an airport and say, Mr. Singh, about 500 will turn and want to know if you're calling them. When I arrived, if you saw an Indian on the other side of the road, you'd walk across and ask him if he wanted to have a cup of tea. You were so lonely and homesick to see the tanned complexion after having left there. Now, if you did that, you wouldn't get anywhere. But one great thing that has happened is Canada has some of the best Indian restaurants in the world, as that has resulted from the tremendous influx. Also, I should say, I'm married to a lovely Canadian gal. We've been married now, I better get this right or I'll have no home to go back to. 44 years. Married in Toronto in 1972. Margie, true blue Canadian, and very subtle in her humor. Raised by her Canadian dad, the subtlest of all things that she's ever said to me in 44 years of marriage. I'm waiting to get to heaven to ask the Lord to give me strength to forgive her for that. But I gave her a big, long hug one day, and she said, I have to say to you, you have the arms of a thinking man. How do you like that? You know, and so I told her I would work hard on getting the arms of a non-thinking man, and she told me it was okay. The rest was all right. So we're happy to claim this as home. Of course, we lived in Toronto all those years, and now all of our 3 children were born there. They're now parents themselves, and we live in Atlanta, Georgia, where we have been since 1985, establishing a base for RZIM following the base first established in Toronto. We're going to miss Andy when he leaves and heads off to Scotland, but he's going to be working with an extraordinary group of people out there, some of the finest minds in reaching a tough situation, and working with David Robertson there from the famed Church of Robert Murray McShane in Dundee. So Andy will be in some very, very historic settings and do a great job. My first opportunity to meet Mary Jo, and I'll look forward to hopefully other opportunities too. I wish they were doing the speaking rather than myself, but here I am. They brought me all this way to say a few things tonight. Now that I've got my vocal cords warmed up, let me begin my message. I was speaking to a Romanian conference 2 days ago in Chicago. I would never have envisioned the day when you would be speaking to 5,000 Romanian Christians in the city of Chicago, just jam-packed in that big auditorium. I remember going to Romania in the 1980s, and I was given a rather dramatic introduction, flying out from somewhere in Germany, I think, to take their airline, the Rome airline, flying into Bucharest. And I called the flight attendant because I said, I thought I had asked for a non-smoking seat. She said, you have a non-smoking seat. I said, but the man next to me is smoking. She said, he has a smoking seat. It gave me an amazing understanding of what dictatorial freedom was all about. That's the way they'd lived, and suddenly and dramatically in 1989, when Ceausescu's life came to a dramatic halt and the country was opened up, today you see a vibrant, fervent faith in that part of the world. But that's what is happening in many parts of the world. You could go to Indonesia today. You'd be amazed at the response that you see in Indonesia. People are even using terms like revival taking place out there. The fastest growing church in the world is in China. You could speak at 6:30 a.m. at a restaurant and invite Chinese businessmen and women to come and listen in, and they will. I had the privilege of spending 3 hours with one of the senior-most official there in their country's leadership. And I was amazed at the questions she asked and had the privilege then of praying with her before that evening was over. But it is almost unprecedented to see what's happened in the West. You look at North America today, and if I go onto a university campus and speak on some pantheistic worldview or other monotheistic worldview other than the Judeo-Christian, I'll be given a very patient hearing. It is culturally and ethnically protected to believe in those counter perspectives. But you stand up and speak on the Christian faith, not only is it seen sort of as a foreign belief now, it is seen as an inimical belief within the culture. And yet we borrow from the entailments and the ethical imperatives of the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's what has actually framed these cultures much more than any other religious worldview. It is the Judeo-Christian worldview and its values that are at the underpinnings of our definitions of life, marriage, home, sexuality, and all that we have lived with in this part of the world. Now we are moving away that foundation, and we are planting our feet firmly in midair. Nothing to sustain, nothing to hold. How do we reach this kind of culture? How do we communicate to this kind of a world? It's getting harder and harder. But the flip side is this, and I say this truthfully, and I'm sure Mary Jo and Andy will agree, and all of my teammates will say the same thing, that you walk into a campus to present a defense of the Christian faith, no matter where you go, the auditorium is packed. It's full. Whether it's Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Oxford or Cambridge or the University of Jakarta or Tsinghua University in Beijing. Wherever we go, they are just filling the place out because the average young student is admitting to at least one thing. They really have not found the answer to the deepest questions of the soul in their university education. Anthony Kronman, professor of law at Yale, has written a book called The End of Education's End. I have just responded to his book in the latest book that I have just completed with my colleague Vince Vitale, Jesus Among Secular Gods. And I've responded to Kronman's thesis. He says basically secularism has failed to deliver meaning to the young university student. Now he blames it on sort of the surrender by the arts to the scientific single vision as sort of being that majestic discipline that interprets all of reality. So he sees it not so much as the inability of secularism to bring meaning as much as this educational system has surrendered what the arts can legitimately do. But if you go back over history and look at the whole field of epistemology, what do I mean by that? The disciplines that were helping us come to certainty in answers. The whole epistemological enterprise has been, how do I know anything for sure? How can I be certain of this knowledge? And if you go back from the rationalists to the empiricists to the existentialists to the postmodernists, what each one of them was doing in taking the finger of one discipline, they assumed they were grabbing the fist of all of reality. In taking the finger of one discipline, they thought they were grabbing the fist of all of reality. Of course, rationalism has a legitimate place, as does empiricism, as does existentialism. But when they were not properly distributed in the roles they could play, we ended up with postmodernism, which actually does away with truth, meaning, and certainty. No absolute truth. Life really doesn't have ultimate meaning, and you cannot be certain of anything. And we have a skeptical culture in which one student at Harvard, quoted by Kelly Monroe in her book, says this: I am allowed to believe anything so long as I don't claim it to be true. I'm allowed to believe anything so long as I don't claim it to be true. Now, we may think in one way this was the dawn of a new day. We call it postmodern. The fact of the matter is, this goes back. Patterns of this were existent long time ago, because it all began right in the original dawn of creation, when the first question was asked, has God really spoken? Is there a transcendent word? Is there an up and a down, or are we just left with the right and the left? Is there an up and a down? When Solomon talked about everything is meaningless under the sun, he said if you lock God out in this horizontal trajectory, you really don't have any meaning to life, and it is all a chasing after the wind. So the first question was, has God spoken? And when you go back to the book of Acts, you see the same type of confusion. You've got the Jewish culture with its religion, you've got the Roman culture with its pagan deities and the worship of Caesars. You've got Greek philosophy floating around, and all those isms were as much there, from the mystery religions to Gnosticism and all the isms around, which only now are sort of distributed more because of our capacity for mass distribution, but the ideas were there right from the beginning. And if you look, for example, at the book of Acts in chapter 24, Saul of Tarsus, converted to Paul, has now got this goal in his mind to get the message to Rome. He was brilliant in his strategic thinking. He knew the Greek language and he used the Roman road, the Greek language and the Roman road, and he insisted that his goal was to ultimately get to the household of Caesar, because if he was going to ultimately change the world, he had to get to Rome and had to get to the Caesars. But here he was coming with a series of testings, nearly killed and dragged around, standing in front of crowds that wanted to stone him, then in front of the Sanhedrin that questioned him. And if it weren't for a voice or two here or there, he would never have made it. Now he is coming to the members of the royal family. And as he is speaking to Felix in chapter 24, it says this: Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When you see the setting, you've got to bring it into your imagination. Clarence Edward McCartney describes the scene. What a contrast. On the throne sat Felix, the faded and withered pagan. A former slave, he became a favorite of Claudius, and by that emperor was exalted to high rank. Greed, cruelty, and lust were stamped upon his countenance. His administration as procurator of Judea had been marked by injustice, extortion, and violence. By his side sat the lovely Jewess Drusilla, a daughter of Herod Agrippa. She had first married a Gentile who, to please her, had become a Jew. Then Felix, with the aid of a sorcerer's incantations, had won her from her husband and was living with her in sin and shame. All that was dishonorable in mankind was represented by that combination of Felix and Drusilla as they sat on the throne awaiting the address by St. Paul. Before them, with chains on his arms and his body scarred with the marks of his suffering for Jesus' sake, and his coarse garment which his own hands had woven, contrasting with the velvet and purple of Felix and his paramour, stood the lonely ambassador for Christ. McCartney, Bruce, and Sefer Bruce, some of the others estimate that she was just a teenager at that time, possibly even as young as 16. But there she was, this young teenage gal, sitting by Felix's side, listening to Paul present a defense of the Christian faith. How did he do it? How did he approach it? What did he say? And I bring to you what I believe are three very simple but persuasive points that I learned from him, because two things have to be observed very carefully: his theological integrity and his methodological genius. His theological integrity and his methodological genius. He retained the coherence and the heart of the gospel, but his method was all the more still persuasive. He didn't compromise either. Truth with relevance are the two indispensable components of effective communication of the gospel. You cannot compromise truth. But if you're merely truthful and sound irrelevant, then the listener is really not going to pay too much of heed to it. So let me see if I can bring for you what it is that he really goes through. The first thing he does is he finds a point of reference on talking about righteousness. Felix, of all people, was one who did not want to deal with that subject. He had lived an indulgent life. He hardly wanted to be talking about righteousness and what is morally upright and so on. Yet Paul broached it, because I want to suggest to you that ultimately all of the arguments that we bring against the existence of God, the hardest argument to still contend with is what we call the moral argument. William Lane Craig presents it. Bill Craig and I were classmates in our graduate days in Chicago, and he framed this argument as simply as I think I've heard it framed, that the whole idea of moral absolutes only exist if God exists. Moral absolutes do exist, therefore God exists. He takes the premises and draws the conclusion. You can argue with either of the premises, but if you admit the two premises, then you have to come to the conclusion as well. Moral absolutes only exist if God exists. Moral absolutes do exist, therefore God exists. And no matter how you look across the tapestry of this world, at some point everybody engages in moral reasoning. This was the Achilles heel of the existentialists. People like Jean-Paul Sartre, who wanted to do away with any absolutes, and yet found it impossible in their own lives not to make moral judgments. He was vociferously against the war in Vietnam and kept speaking against it, although existentially he believed every person has the right to pull themselves up by their own moral bootstraps and find meaning. So that in his final days he said, my existentialist atheistic philosophy was incoherent and unlivable. Same with Anthony Flew. In the 1980s, when I was doing my work in philosophy, Anthony Flew, as an atheist, his books were required reading for us in the study of Christian apologetics, how to deal with the atheistic arguments. And yet, not too long ago, before he passed away, he himself conceded that his philosophy was actually incoherent. And he was deeply committed to the readings of C.S. Lewis particularly, and several other contemporary writers. He dialogued and discussed with many contemporary Christian thinkers and openly spoke about the fact that N.T. Wright's treatment of the resurrection was one of the most persuasive things he'd ever read. And if this indeed turned out to be true, he said, it would be the peg on which he could hang all of his belief as well. You see, causality was the argument of Thomas Aquinas. Anything that comes into being needs a cause. You cannot have an infinite regress of causes. Therefore, you have to have an ultimate first cause. And since nothing material explains its own existence, the only possibility for an ultimate explanation would be something, an entity that is non-material. But try to present the causality argument today and you'll get all kinds of headwinds and all kinds of challenging responses. Try to bring the design argument, specified complexity. Nobody would ever believe that the dictionary developed because of an explosion in a printing press. You see specified complexity. You see design. How much more in the 3.1 billion bits of human DNA information? How does primordial slime produce an Einstein? But the design argument, you present it and you know the counter arguments for that. The moral argument, though, is like a thorn in the side of the atheist. Again and again and again, he or she tries to come up with an explanation. The Canadian General Dallaire, when he was in Rwanda, a world prominent president, visited and kept the engines in his plane running because he didn't want to spend too long there. And after he spent a little bit of time on the ground, went back to his plane and flew off, and he made the comment, "I didn't know it was this bad." And the Canadian General said, "Didn't know? You didn't know? You cannot," here are his words, "you cannot simply Pontius Pilate 800,000 people. Cannot just wash your hands of it and say, I didn't know." When nearly 1 million people were slaughtered, butchered. In fact, when I was speaking in Jakarta about a month ago at the Lausanne Young Leaders Conference, a Rwandan came up and asked his one question: how do you reach my people where we have lived with such genocide and such cruelty? See, it is irrepressible to raise the question of moral reasoning. And so I say to you, it is not at all accidental that Paul begins with the moral reasoning. But I want to point out one incredibly different thing in the Christian message that Paul, I believe, would have approached. You see, Paul was a Hebrew by birth. He was a citizen of Rome, and he'd studied in a Greek city. The worlds converged within his heart. The Hebrews gave to us our moral categories. The Romans gave to us our legal categories. The Greeks gave to us our philosophical categories. If you'd asked the Hebrew to quintessentially describe the ideal, he would have said light. The Lord is my light and my salvation. This is the light that lights everyone that comes into the world. If you'd asked the Greeks to give the quintessence of reality, they would have said it's knowledge, episteme, to know. You have to know. They gave to the world the academy and the universities. So for the Hebrews it was light. For the Greeks it was knowledge. For the Romans it was glory, the glory of their cities, the glory of the Caesars, the glory of their empires. Here was a man, the Hebrew world, the Greek world, the Roman world converged into him. What did he say to the church at Corinth? God, who caused the light to shine out of darkness, has caused his light to shine in our hearts, to give to us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus our Lord. He took all of the abstractions, all of the abstract essences of light, knowledge, glory, and that beam shone upon the face of Jesus, the perfect life. That's why Pilate says, I don't find any fault in this man. The thief on the cross says, this man has done nothing amiss. Jesus looked at his accusers and says, which of you convinces me of any sin? You have the perfect Savior. And my answer to the Rwandan gentleman was, when you're speaking to a person that has gone through what you have to speak through the wounds. And the only one who can fully understand those wounds is the perfect one, the perfect Savior, who was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. The marvelous truth of the gospel that we bring to this world. You will never see this impeccable life, this pristine life, this pure life, unspotted, that withstood every barb and yet went to the cross for you and for me. You see, when I talk about the gospel message in this world, I have to remind people that we struggle with moral reasoning, but the message of Jesus gets even deeper than that. It brings us to a point of recognizing what morality itself simply cannot do. All the morality in the world will not help you ultimately to stand before God. It is the fact that you and I are broken on the inside. We are shattered on the inside. It is the pride of your heart and mine. And so when he is talking to Felix about righteousness, he is getting to the core of the fact that morality alone was not going to help him. That's why the gospel message is a message not of moral reasoning. It's a message of grace and a message of forgiveness and a message that does for us what moral reasoning alone cannot do. And it is as the Christ who enters into your heart who changes how you think, who changes not just what you do, but what you want to do. Almost every one of us here who knows the Lord is tempted. We are all tempted. But there are many temptations to which we will not yield because the hungers that God has placed in our heart transcend the desire that comes in temptation alone, and we walk away from it. Like Joseph in the Old Testament, who looks at Potiphar's wife and says, I can't do this to you. Your husband has entrusted me with everything, all of his property. You're not his property, you're his wife. And I cannot break the law of God. There was no way to argue against Joseph on that. He invoked the law of God, the boundaries that God has set for you and for me. And ladies and gentlemen, why do we struggle in the West today? We do not know where to turn for our laws anymore because we think of laws as being so rigorous and restricting rather than understanding that they are given for our benefit. You know, Robert Shapiro, who was one of the lead attorneys in the O.J. Simpson trial, somebody was asking him in an interview very recently whether justice was done. Megyn Kelly from Fox was interviewing Robert Shapiro. In the exoneration of O.J. Simpson, whoever murdered them was accused of breaking Nicole's neck, brutally murdering her and her friend who was there. And so Megyn Kelly looked at Robert Shapiro and says, was justice done? When he was set free, he gave his answer. He says, Megyn, there's moral justice and there's legal justice. Legal justice was done. If that had been his daughter, he would not be that glib about moral justice and legal justice. The law ought always to be connected to what is morally upright. But even then, the law cannot save you and me. And I like what the Apostle Paul says of himself, of sinners, of whom I am chief. He knew he needed a Savior. So Paul brings a point of reference. Secondly and quickly, he brings a point of relevance. he talks about self-control, about the ability to resist. Obviously, Felix had no self-control. And here Paul is talking about that. We must find points of relevance in our day. How do we get relevant to a culture where the imagination has been plundered, where the intellect has been plundered, where so many definitions are gone? Do you realize for the first time in civilized history, after 5 millennia of civilized history, we are the first ones who have lost the definitions for the most basic, self-evident claims we have made for 5,000 years. We've redefined the most basic things which for 5,000 years were given as self-evident truths. You don't believe them anymore. And we call it progress. That's the new term for a philosophy, for a political movement, progressive. Progressive? Progressive has to tell me what the destination is. It's a mobile term. How can we call ourselves progressives as civilized people when in the 20th century we killed more people on a battlefield than the previous 19 put together? Maybe it's about time to get some regressives and move back in some of our thinking. How do we get to the points of relevance? Years ago when my wife and I was doing some meetings in Hawaii and Margie was with me, and I said to her, years ago I read the biography of Joseph Damien, the Belgian priest who had come to Molokai a long while ago. And Damien came because his brother had committed to come to Molokai to work with the people of leprosy that was sent into that beautiful island, some of the world's tallest sea cliffs. But the people with leprosy were sent into Molokai, and Damien's brother had committed to go and become a missionary there, but the brother passed away rather suddenly, and on his deathbed he asked Joseph if he would go in his place. So Joseph Damien took his brother's mantle and went to Molokai. And I'd read the biography. Damien, I think it's one of the biographies is called Damien the leper, or the man who worked with people with leprosy. So we arrived. At that time you had to make private arrangements, get a small plane and arrive. Margie and I arrived there, and there was a man who showed us around. Fascinating place to see what Damien had accomplished there. And then as we are about to leave, we see his grave. And he's the one, of course, who built a chapel, helped them find a cure. And I said, so Damien is buried here? He said, not really. I said, but you've got a marker here with his name. He said, well, originally he was. But the Belgian government decided they wanted him back. And they told us we could not bury one of their nationals here. He had to be flown back. The people with leprosy pleaded and begged. You see, there came a day where Damien was pouring a kettle of hot boiling water into a cup, and the water swirled out and fell onto his foot. And all of a sudden it dawned on him, he had no feeling. He took some more of that hot water, poured it on the other foot. He had no feeling. None of them knew that morning why he began his sermon with a different line. He always began by saying, my fellow believers. That morning he stood up and said, my fellow lepers. He'd contracted it. So he took upon himself their very disease in the process of finding rescue for them. They pleaded and begged that the body be kept there. And the Belgian government said, no, we want it back. So finally they said, do you mind if we cut off his hand or his arm, the hand that touched us, arm that was put around us, and bury that here? You can have the rest of the body. And they agreed. Said, so his hand is buried here in Molokai, the hand that reached out and touched. And to you young men and women, I say this, the deepest touch in the soul is the touch of love and the touch of compassion. We will never really reach this world without that touch, without reaching out, without demonstrating to them that we really, really care. And when we talk of justice, it is love that propels the rights and the need for justice in this world. My daughter Naomi works with women and children at risk, children with AIDS from prostitution of their mothers in my office in Atlanta, I have right by my desk a painting of little children. And one of them has got his arms raised up like this, and they've all got their hands raised and they're praying. It's a beautiful picture of children with AIDS in a place that my daughter's life has touched. Why that picture? When I was having my back surgery, which was pretty serious in 2002, they were going to bracket me from mid-back all the way down to my sacrum with 8 screws bolting me in and all of that. When these kids heard about that, they called a prayer meeting. Here they are, tiny little ones. And this little boy with a blue t-shirt, hands raised up, eyes closed, asking God to touch the hands of the surgeon that were going to be touching my back and operating upon it. If you walked into that home, as my colleagues have, and see the women who are in prostitution who've been rescued and transformed, and the little kids with AIDS who've been loved and given a home, whether they're this young or one 19-year-old boy there came to me and said, I've read all of your books. And he was quoting them. The heart of compassion and the heart of love. That's the point of relevance for us today. We cannot win this world without loving the person that Christ died for. Point of reference, point of relevance, and finally the point of disturbance. We cannot hold back what the gospel message brings, and sometimes it is discomforting. Sometimes it is discomforting. It's not always a point of comfort. It is discomforting. And he spoke of the judgment that was to come. See, we are so afraid to tell people that one way or the other, when we go the wrong way, we end up with judgment, whether we like it or not. I was recently with a friend. I won't say too much, but my colleagues know exactly whom I'm talking about. Because I attended the funeral of this man who headed up one of the largest financial institutions in the world, in Europe, worth a lot of money. He was the CEO. But the last year or two, it wasn't doing very well. The company wasn't doing well. And the media went after him and all kinds of things happened. And on a given evening, about 2 months ago, he was supposed to come home for dinner. And his wife was waiting and waiting and waiting. We just spent a week with his wife, who flew in to where we were to accompany us for some meetings. And she went over the whole story again. She goes over to this beautiful home they had, which was not their main home. All the doors are locked. All the windows are bolted down. She realized something horrible possibly had taken place and called the police. They break the doors down and enter, and he'd put a gun to his head and killed himself in his 50s. And she told us, she said, when I was cleaning out the house, I was seeing all the reports of his successes, all the glorious things he'd accomplished. Thought to myself, it all came to nothing. Yesterday when I was home, my wife showed me an article about Faye Dunaway, the actress who'd won the Oscar. And there's a picture of her reclining in her chair the morning after the Oscar. And she says, is this it? This is what I've really been living for all this while? She said, this is sad. This is so sad. See, all the treasures the world has to offer only make you want more or disappoint you. But when Christ comes into your life, he moves you into a life of perpetual novelty, where you enjoy the way life is meant to be lived. Now what happens? Point of reference, point of relevance, point of disturbance. He talks about how judgment is real. Even in this world we see it. What does Felix do? He wants to see if he can trip up the messenger, because he couldn't trip up the message. If he could cause the messenger to stumble, that was it. He would have won. So he kept him to see if he'd offer him a bribe. If Paul had succumbed to the bribe, then righteousness self-control and judgment would have meant nothing to him either. He would have squandered it all. Paul honored the trust. It's a very fearful thing to claim to be a Christian if you're not going to live it. It's even more fearful if you're a Christian speaker and don't live it. Because like a big tree, when you fall, you bring many other saplings down with you. One of the countries we just finished meetings in, church was thriving, the church at large, but one or two key leaders fell with corruption. And the young people are now scrambling to find out, does this all really mean anything? And so I say to you, if you really want to honor him, you have to honor him in your life. And that's why I think Paul made a difference. They couldn't trip him up. They did everything possible. He finished the course with joy. And there was a man once upon a time lowered in by a basket over a wall, ended up writing 1/3 of the New Testament and changed history. He knew how to deal with his time. It's your time and mine now. We've got to find points of reference, points of relevance, and not shy away from the point of disturbance. It should always be undergirded by the love of God. And when people see that genuine message in you, they will find it very hard to argue against that. I believe the days of the church, the greatest days, are still ahead, and we see the young coming to Christ in large numbers all over the world. That's why many of you are here, so young, still in the freshness of your youth. And because of men and women like you, I have confidence in the future. May God bless you. Thank you for giving me a hearing.